That moment when you realize your skincare is actually working. That's Rodan and Fields, the #1 female dermatologist-founded skincare brand in the U.S. Designed by 2 dermatologists who don't just know women's skin, they know how to formulate for it. Rodan and Fields, love what you see. Tap the banner or visit rodanandfields.com/Spotify to get your exclusive welcome offer.
Clorox Sentiva smells like grapefruit. Cleans like Clorox. And feels like...
Okay, we could be here all day. Try Clorox Sentiva for a trusted clean with long-lasting freshness. Also available in lavender and coconut. Use as directed.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. After the news broke on Tuesday that Amazon might be labeling its products with the added costs of President Trump's tariffs, the White House issued a veiled threat toward Amazon. After that, Amazon quickly announced that there was no such plan after all. Then we learned that Trump had called up Amazon founder Jeff Bezos to express his anger over the decision. And subsequently, Trump boasted to reporters that Bezos had listened to him and acted. This is an absurd abuse of power, and it comes as a new poll from the Public Religion Research Institute sheds some really interesting new light on what Americans think of abuses like these. Today we're talking about all of this with Melissa Deckman, a political scientist who's also the CEO of PRRI and knows this data well. Melissa, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Greg. I appreciate you talking about our survey today.
So let's start with Trump and Amazon. Trump's tariffs are going to drive up costs for consumers across the country. There was this report that Amazon was going to list out the costs imposed by tariffs on its products. Then we heard from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, who said this.
This is a hostile and political act by Amazon. Why didn't Amazon do this when the Biden administration hiked inflation to the highest level in 40 years? And I would also add that it's not a surprise because, as Reuters recently wrote, Amazon has partnered with a Chinese propaganda arm.
And then Trump himself said he had personally talked to Bezos.
Jeff Bezos was very nice. He was terrific. He solved the problem very quickly, and he did the right thing, and he's a good guy.
Melissa, that's not okay. The White House shouldn't be threatening private companies for flirting with the idea of telling the truth about Trump policies, should they?
No, not at all. You know, wearing my political scientist hat, it made me think about when I used to teach a course on the presidency for many years. We talk about the imperial presidency. And this was, of course, this era during the late 60s, early 70s, largely in response to the Vietnam War, where many people thought the president was taking too much power unilaterally without the control of Congress. Those days, however, look quite quaint compared to, I think, what we're seeing now, when I would argue in some ways we are seeing an imperial presidency because we really have a president who is willing to use the full throttle of the administrative state, the office, to really get private businesses, universities, law firms to really bend to his will. It's really remarkable. And I think it really is a violation of sort of the idea of kind of checks and balances, the role of government in our society. It's pretty remarkable.
I like to refer to it as an all of government or whole of government approach to authoritarian rule. They're using every single agency they conceivably can in every conceivable way they can invent to arrogate more and more power in the presidency, right?
Yeah. And just thinking about it from an economic perspective, if you look at it through the lens of kind of traditional conservative republicanism, you know, I think about Milton Friedman. I'm not an economist, but this idea of a planned economy, right? Having government dictate the terms of what is going to be sold at what price is really pretty much blasphemy, according to that kind of school of thought. And so it is a pretty remarkable change of events, the overreach that we're seeing with this presidency on even on sectors that heretofore have largely been touted. The proper role and scope of government should be government getting out, right? The invisible hand should be invisible. It really shouldn't be this blatant and obvious.
Well, what you're getting at there is the GOP's takeover by MAGA. I think there's actually some continuity between the GOP and MAGA in many ways. Trump is really more of an exacerbation than some sort of new aberration, but he is an exacerbation. I mean, he has essentially turned the Republican Party into something that just doesn't question things like this, even when they go against the Republican Party's own stated principles.
Or they go against the interest of their voters, right? If you think about the growth of Trump's support among the working class, even among, I think, the working class of color to some extent, at least from 2024, these sorts of policies are just really bad for the base, economically speaking.
They're going to get killed by these tariffs, and so are farmers as well. So on to the PRRI poll, the new poll, it asks a novel question. It asks respondents if they agree that, quote, Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy, or alternatively, if they agree that Trump is a, quote, strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore America's greatness. Your poll found that 52% of Americans picked the first of those, seeing him as a dictator, versus only 44% who picked the second option. Why did you guys design the question survey that way? What were you trying to measure?
Well, I think we were getting at trying to find a question that would break through and really demonstrate, Americans' thoughts on Trump's overall behavior, right? There's lots in terms of the specifics of his policies, and we can talk about that. But we wanted a question that really put in stark relief really what we're seeing here. Are we seeing someone who's dictatorial, who's willing to use the powers of the government in many ways that usurp American democracy? Or, are we seeing that Americans might be more supportive of more authoritarian tendencies within the administration? And so this question kind of cuts through the noise, and I think it's pretty revealing. If you had told me even 4 years ago that a majority of Americans would describe a president as a dictator, I would have been surprised at that. But yet this is where we are in this political moment.
Well, what's interesting about this question and the way you designed it is that it basically puts a negative spin, extremely negative spin, on what we're all seeing with our own eyes, and then puts a more positive one on what we're all seeing. And openly defining Trump as a dictator in the survey question, you would expect would push respondents away from supporting that reading. But you have a majority supporting this idea. So can you tell us how independents broke down on that particular question? Again, on one side, it's do you view Trump as a dangerous dictator? And on the other, it's do you view Trump as a strong leader who needs these powers to restore American greatness? How did independents break down?
So we found that independents are far more likely to agree with the first statement than the second. So 56% of independents basically say that Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy, versus 42% who really viewed him more as a strong leader who needs those powers to restore America's greatness.
That's remarkable. I should underscore that other polls have actually shown fairly strong opposition among independents as well to some of Trump's lawless abuses of power on immigration in particular, which is really interesting because you'd think that independents in the center of the electorate, maybe they're not so pro-immigration, but when what Trump is doing is understood as lawless acts, as being about fundamental fairness and due process and the rule of law, majorities of independents oppose these things. And you're finding that 56% of independents see Trump as a dangerous dictator as opposed to a strong leader who should be given the power he needs is just really stunning to me. It really underscores, I think, the degree to which independents are alienated by abuses of power. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And maybe we return again to immigration. I'm actually thinking back to when Trump was first president in his first term. I think most Americans, regardless of ideology, regardless of partisanship, would agree that for all intents and purposes, our border has been broken, right? We don't have a policy that works. I think liberals would say that. I think conservatives would say that, right? But I think what you saw in Donald Trump, who of course has always been motivated by sort of anti-immigrant sentiment, right? The Great Replacement theory, all these sorts of things. Trump likes to extol those ideas all the time when he was on the campaign trail. So you had the overreach of family separation, for example. And I think what we found historically when Trump overreaches in terms of these policies, and we asked a question about should immigrants who are in the country illegally be interned in camps guarded by the military before they're deported, which is actually happening in Guantanamo Bay, right? All these sorts of things. Very unpopular with most Americans, save the Republican base and white evangelical Protestants. We find by and large that independents are not supportive of that. So when there's been an overreach in terms of policy, when it comes to immigration in particular, it really drives, I think, public opinion in the opposite direction.
Spring is finally here. For us in DC, that means cherry blossom, warmer weather, and more breaking news each and every day. To stay up to date on all the news that you need to know, there's no better place than the DSR Network. And there's no better way to enjoy the DSR Network than to become a member. Members enjoy an ad-free listening experience, access to our Discord community, exclusive content, and more. Use code DSR2025 for a 40% off discount on sign-up at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's code DSR2025 at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
I want to flag another finding in this poll that's fascinating. 78% of Americans disagree with the following statement, quote, "When decisions by Congress or the Supreme Court hold our country back, the president should be able to ignore them." By contrast, only 18% agree. I think the story here from these findings might be that Americans grasp a core fact about this moment, which is that Trump is trying to concentrate for himself and for the presidency a truly immense amount of power, one that's deeply destructive to how the system is supposed to function at the most fundamental level. Do you think that's right?
I think that what I take away from these findings, looking at the idea of the basic constitutional design, like the separation of powers, checks and balances, all of those sorts of things, Americans have I think, a strong regard for those principles, especially checks and balances, right? We don't find that even among Republicans, right? We don't find support for the idea that Trump should, or any president rather, should disregard what is actually happening with the courts. I think we're in that crisis right now because, of course, now with the case involving the man from Maryland, Kilmar Abrego Garcia was extradited to a prison in El Salvador, despite the fact the lower court said this was unconstitutional. And you had a unanimous Supreme Court. This is a court that rarely decides anything from a unanimous perspective, saying that they had to facilitate his return, and that still hasn't happened. It's a pretty remarkable act right now in our American political history. And again, most Americans, not even a majority of Republicans, say that presidents should disregard what the Supreme Court is saying.
You guys also find in the poll that 7 in 10 adherents of Christian nationalism see Trump positively as a strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore America's greatness, whereas only a small minority of them see Trump as a dictator figure. Meanwhile, you've got that 44%, as we discussed at the beginning, who don't see Trump as a dictator. In a way, with those numbers, you're kind of delineating the voters who are potentially genuinely authoritarian or have real authoritarian sympathies, right? Can you talk about that pool of voters? Who are they?
Yeah. And so I would also recommend last fall, we did a very path-breaking survey release looking at the underpinnings of authoritarianism within the U.S. population, right? And so not surprisingly, Christian nationalist adherents are the strongest in terms of support for a strongman. And so Christian nationalists adherents are folks who believe that America was founded and should remain a Christian nation. And they believe that Christians should have preferential treatment, like strongly believe this, right? And if you believe that God has ordained you to be here, and if you believe that God ordains a certain design of how government should be run, the order of, how society should be set up hierarchically, all those sorts of things, then the Constitution and due process and the norms of a democracy are far less important. And so those kinds of individuals are among the most, I think, strongest adherents of, they're among the most strongest supporters of Donald Trump. We find that pretty consistently. And of course, I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of Trump's agenda, not all of it certainly, but a lot of it's driven by Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation, which is a longstanding conservative organization. So from pro-natalist policies to banning reproductive rights to getting rid of, the rights of transgender Americans to getting rid of DEI initiatives, all of these are of accord that kind of harken back to some Christian nationalist viewpoints. And so I'm not surprised at all throughout the report. You'll see the strongest supporters for Trump, for his policies and administration really come from Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalist views.
Can we talk about the whole pool of voters who seem to have authoritarian tendencies? It looks as if it's maybe a minority of the country. It's hard to tell exactly how big because it's a little hard to measure, but it's got to be at least a third. Who do you think is in that pool in addition to Christian nationalists?
Yeah, so we found pretty consistently that about 4 in 10 Americans we would describe as having more support for authoritarian tendencies, right? And so in addition, of course, to Christian nationalist adherents and even sympathizers, these are folks who generally support the ideas of Christian nationalism, maybe not to the same extent as who we classify as adherents. That's about 30% of the U.S. Population. But clearly, it's the base of the party, strong Republicans. I mean, I think Republicans have been far more likely to endorse these kinds of views. We see that showing up over and over in our poll. If you go back to last fall's survey of authoritarianism, it's many Republicans as well. But I think a consistent finding, it's really a good 35 to 40% of the country, right, are really behind Donald Trump, this kind of MAGA base. These are the folks who are watching Fox News or more conservative news outlets. They're getting their news and information from podcasts that lean in that direction. And they're certainly getting their ideas about policy are shaped very dramatically by this right-wing echo chamber in lots of ways. All those sorts of things, I think, have endeared Trump and his approach to a lot of these folks. Look, a lot of these folks think that America's broken, and that you really need a strong man who's willing to scramble some eggs or to break things in order to fix it. And so they're less willing to say that the principles of democracy, the rule of law, the things that are encoded in our Constitution are really, really important.
So to bring this back to Bezos and Trump, I think what's emerging here, the big story is that there's this small authoritarian core in the country, but there's this large body of voters in the middle that includes independents, maybe a fair amount of whom voted for Trump, who originally went into this, meaning voted for Trump, with the thought that, as you said, this is a guy who will break the furniture, he'll knock heads together, he'll make things work. But they're not there when it comes to the actual authoritarianism. And when they start to see that, they get alienated. And what strikes me about all this is that you've got today's thing where Trump bullied Amazon and Jeff Bezos, and the White House threatened Amazon. They're all out there boasting about this. Trump advisors are out. Stephen Miller went on TV and basically gloated about what had happened. Caroline Leavitt was clearly flaunting the fact that they were bullying Amazon, a private company with White House power. Trump gloated about the fact that Bezos had essentially bent the knee to him. They don't seem to care that the middle of the country is alienated by this stuff. What do you make of that?
I think you have really a newly emboldened Donald Trump who has learned some lessons from his first term in office. He, of course, has surrounded himself by administrators who, are willing to really not even just push the needle, but to go all the way over into acts that I think, frankly, are quite unconstitutional. It's not necessarily something, though, that we see in our survey today that most Americans endorse. To be fair, I think that most Americans voted for Donald Trump, and we did see him make gains, like with Hispanic voters, with some African American voters, not as many as I think initially thought potentially, but with younger voters, Gen Z men in particular. But I think what was really driving that was really frustration, not just with the political system, but with the economy, right? You had, for the first time in decades, sustained inflation that was largely a product of COVID and looking at supply chains and all of that, the vestiges of that. But nonetheless, this was really new for a large share of American voters. And for those Americans who don't pay a lot of attention, they're like, hey, I vaguely remember that life was more affordable in the first Trump administration. They also really didn't like Joe Biden. And so that made them, I think, cast their lever for Donald Trump. But you don't have Americans voting for a system that's purely authoritarian, and yet, or for a system in which the president can routinely disregard what the courts say. I think Congress right now, of course, is marching in lockstep with Trump because you have a slim majority, of course, both houses being controlled by Republicans who are supporting him. But nonetheless, I don't think this is what many Americans signed up for when they voted for Donald Trump last fall.
It sure sounds as if the findings of this poll are that the middle of the country is alienated by this stuff pretty strongly.
Yeah, we'll have to see. We're only 100 days in. There's a lot left to look at in terms of his performance in office. I think that Americans are also going to probably be very fatigued by Donald Trump, right? I think the constant, bombardment of changes that are being afoot, whether it's, DOGE cuts or disregarding, court decisions. I think what's really going to happen, my prediction is that once tariffs are fully in effect, and the cost of everyday living goes up, I think many Americans are going to turn pretty quickly. But I also think if, in fact, we see a situation where Medicaid cuts are on the table, where Social Security checks aren't coming in on a regular basis, and people are trying to call their office and figure this out, the mechanisms of government that by and large are largely popular with the American public are really being threatened. And I think on that front is where you'll see, I think, more disapproval of Trump's job as president.
I totally agree. I think what we're going to see develop here is ports are going to stop getting products in, shelves are going to be empty, government's going to be breaking down in its core services, and Trump's authoritarianism is just going to be sitting out there on the table without any kind of actual effective governance behind it, and it's going to get a whole lot worse for the president. Melissa Deckman, thank you so much for coming on with us today. Great discussion.
Oh, thank you so much. Glad to be here.
On May 14th, the New Republic's editor, Michael Tomasky, and staff writers Matt Ford, Timothy Noah, Tori Otten, and myself will host the next in our series, America in Crisis. With the new administration in place, this event will bring together influential political commentators with TNR's most engaged readers to explore what we can do to fight back against Trump's anti-democratic rampage. Join us on May 14th. You can register at atlasarts.org/events/TNR. Thanks so much.